Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 25th episode of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast all about the subject of antinatalism created by antinatalists. My name is Oldphan Sukenick, also known as Foreverwolffilms on YouTube.
And I'm Mark J. Maharaj, also known as ? On YouTube.
And today, we're speaking with antinatalist YouTuber video essayist, Seven of Swords.
Anti-natalism, at its core, will not be accepted by the vast majority of human species. As such, it will always remain a minority position among any human population. The political ramifications of our ethical position will be not only seen as a threat to the more successful means of political hegemony, such as a neoliberal capitalism, but also to the more fringe reactionary rightist and further leftist political positions. The mere suggestion of our ethical stance is a politically unruly one. Stop procreating carries with it the death of a nation, the ceasing of a corrupt and brutal legacy of birth created simply because people were either raped or did not bother to question if holding a viable pregnancy to term is at all ethical. Antinatalism is the end of politics, and as such, we have political adversaries.
So, welcome, Seven. Thank you so much for being our guest today on Exploring Antinatalism.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having me and actually inviting me to do something like this. This is pretty awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're thrilled to have you.
Let me start out by asking you just some basic questions about yourself. In your words, who is Seven of Swords?
Seven of Swords is... He is a bicameral function of necroglossics. He's like this post-human entity that doesn't really fit in well with any sort of a politics that tries to categorize him with any sort of natalist agenda, essentially. He's not really like a very orthodox person that would think in very orthodox ways, I guess I could say.
Fascinating answer already. So do you feel like you're developing sort of a character? Seven of Swords is a character that you're developing?
It's an open-ended question.
Okay.
That I think he's on a journey to trying to discover with his YouTube channel. It kind of started out as being more or less therapeutic, but then it developed into something a bit more sophisticated. It's a bit more of a sophisticated project.
I see. Okay. May I ask, just real quick, can you explain sort of the meaning behind your channel's name, Seven of Swords? What is the meaning behind that name?
So it comes from there's a tarot card called Seven of Swords. And to my understanding, that card represents some sort of a secretive sort of entity that needs to keep revealing certain things to those that it keeps wanting to engage with.
Okay.
And Seven of Swords is essentially like a highly technocratically sophisticated way of putting forth that sort of occult idea.
Okay, yeah, I remember that card. How did you get interested in antinatalism, and why are you an antinatalist, Seven?
So when I first heard of antinatalism, it was from an Amazing Atheist video or one of his podcasts or something back in like 2012, maybe 2013, somewhere between 2012 and 2014. And he was talking about Inmendum, and he was pretty much just saying that like Inmendum was crazy or something. And I very briefly looked into it and I thought, well, this is just wrong, because I was very pro-natal at the time, not really thinking too much about what the consequences of procreation entail. And then I started to study philosophy in an academic setting, and I started to run into some rather difficult situations in my life where I didn't think that I could justify putting other people into a similar situation, such as myself. And I started to look into the philosophy a lot more. And comes my my senior year of college, and I pretty much just went full antinatalist because one, I think the argument's very logical and persuasive put forth by Benatar. And also, I find it extremely difficult to try to respond to seemingly intuitive premises that we might accept for our arguments. And also, during that time period, I started looking into like vegan anti-natalist, and sort of the argumentation coming from different anti-natalist camps, like the Cabreras and the Benatarians.
Yeah.
And I remember the first anti-natalist video that I made was kind of a response to Benatar, but I think I changed my mind on that. And I think I think that the Benatarians and the Cabreras can both make extremely compelling cases. So I think I might have been a little too hasty in my criticisms of Benatar in my first video, perhaps, but yeah.
Academically, how did you go down that road to pessimistic thought? Like, were you studying more? It seems to be that your style is more of the continental persuasion. Is that correct?
I guess you could say that. One of my first videos that I made on anti-natalism was considering arguments of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a lot more influenced by like analytic philosophy. I wanted to try to logically break down what would be the constituent parts of an antinatal view, because at the time to me it seemed like we didn't really have the most consistent way of cataloging and making a taxonomy of our arguments. So I was like, well, what's the one thing that they all have in common? Well, they're all going to be talking about risk in the same sort of vein as Rivka Weinberg's hazardous materials argument, which I think is a brilliant argument. But yeah, like, I don't know if I addressed the question fully.
Well, I was just curious. So like the exploration came from a self-directed thing, right? Like, or was there something in school that opened up the path to, like, I don't know, Schopenhauer or Turan or...
Oh, okay. So I took a course on modernism, and I also wrote my senior thesis on this really intricate problem in epistemology. And when I wrote my paper, I pretty much thought that, well, if I could just look at a skeptic's argument, and it's not like I get necessarily epistemically obliterated, I could look at anybody's philosophical argument on anything, no matter how radical it is, and perhaps they might be able to make a good case. So I think I became more open-minded toward an antinatal view from writing that paper. But I also, before that, I read author Schopenhauer's essay, I think it's on suicide, or of suicide, because I know Hume wrote one too, and they have like a similar name. But I just found the position that I think Schopenhauer took as being pretty respectable.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I think it deserves to be said that this was honestly one of the most difficult interviews that I personally have had the task of preparing for. Your content is extremely rich in both vision and in reference. You pull from inspirations, both academic, philosophical, political, and of internet origin that previously to this, I, for one, and I think for Mark, at least in some circumstances as well, we're completely unaware of before this. And I thank you for that. So much of it, regardless of whether I or we agree with it or not, it's been fascinating to research. I realize that this is quite a lot to ask you to encapsulate, but can you describe for us what your overall vision behind your channel is, and what your vision and position on antinatalism as you speak it through your channel is? What all does it entail?
Yeah, no problem. I think that I want to take antinatalism to the most radical means that I possibly can. And I think that certain political ideologies, or at least their aesthetics, could lend a sort of way of looking at how that might be able to be seen. Which is why in my Para video, the one about the potential antinatalists like Paramilitary, I drew like inspiration from looking at several conflicting groups on the planet that arose from pretty much the last century. That includes like FARC and the Contras and the Mujahideen and any other sort of very radical group, even perhaps stemming into radical white nationalism, if that happens to be the case, which I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with politically, but it's just the aesthetic of you're surrounded by perhaps a potential majority of people that will not ever agree with you on perhaps something that is irreconcilable.
Mm-hmm.
And at what lengths are we going to have to come to terms with potential political problems that can't be solved using rhetoric or some sort of a dialectical notion of how we're going to set up speech or whatever? And once you see that point, it begs the question, well, at what point should people be armed because those differences are so irreconcilable that leads to further political problems?
When I was preparing for this interview, I asked you if you had any reading material, a reading list, reading list of suggestions, and you kindly provided a fascinating list of suggestions, some of which I still have a lot of questions about, and just about how you feel they fit into your conception of antinatalism and what you believe. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you about some of these individual references now. The first would be Rene Descartes. I was intrigued to see Descartes suggested on your reading list, though I don't fully understand how Descartes relates. Can you go into that a bit?
Yeah, no problem. Really, Descartes' meditations, I really only like his first meditation. Everything, I don't think he really does the best philosophically rigorous job of getting out of his what philosophers could call Cartesian doubt, or you could call it like global skepticism.
Okay.
I think it just really pushes the epistemic boundaries of what we consider to be intuitively the case for justifying how we can know what we can know about the external world.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, I think that it primes or prepares people for more interesting debate about perhaps what we are actually doing with what we claim to be the external world, or in what ways can it perhaps be manipulated, or how other people in the past have manipulated it to make it seem like this is simply all that there is, when really it might not be the case, if that makes sense. And I think that I read somewhere that Benatar said something very interesting with this regard. With I'm paraphrasing him, I think, but he said something to the effect of what we claim to know is a lot closer to it being the case that we absolutely don't know anything than it being the case that than it being compared to everything that there could possibly be to know. So like if you imagine knowledge on two poles, one being we don't know anything, we're absolutely ignorant, we don't escape the Cartesian trap, pretty much set up in his first meditation. And then the second pole being there's a potential to know absolutely everything. Benatar is saying that we're a lot closer to the pole of us not being able to know anything, even with our collective knowledge that we have as of late. So I still think that given a skeptical scenario that Descartes might lay out, like we might be a brain in a vat, or we might be dreaming or whatever, and that suggestion made by Benatar, I think that it needs to scare philosophers in a way such that they want to continue to go further than the philosophers before them, and to keep going further and further, essentially, pretty much indefinitely, I guess, until everyone's dead.
Okay.
Maybe that could be questioned, so we'll see.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. The next one I want to ask you is Mark Fisher. So I am extremely curious to hear you talk more about Mark Fisher and how you feel he fits into your conception of antinatalism. Fisher, a huge revelation for me, I have to say. We both ended up buying and reading Capitalist Realism for the purposes of this interview. Fisher is, for those of you that don't know, and I really didn't realize this until very recently, but Fisher is a bit of an unsung antinatal hero in some respects. I mean, I was shocked to realize that I had, in fact, been on his website, K-Punk, years previously, because he did, in fact, write about the subject of antinatalism, nearly being the one to coin the term antinatalism, actually, years before Théophile de Guerreau and Benatar, way back in 2004. So, Seven, who is Mark Fisher, and how are your views influenced by him?
Yeah, so Mark Fisher, I think he kind of represents like the, for how I understand it, and from some of the videos that I've seen or some of the blogs that I've read, in the sort of accelerationist space, he's kind of like the go-to guy for like left accelerationism, or LACC, in my opinion. I think that his conversations with like Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, I think, and Walter, I think he might even be speaking with Walter Benjamin in capitalist realism. I think it kind of laid out a sort of method of thinking about what we're doing with our social space, which is capital and capitalism, and how we've actually come up with a system in which, am I allowed to curse on the show?
Go for it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, in which it's kind of batshit a little bit, to say the least. We have some of the greatest productive forces ever managed in the history of mankind, but like there are skyrocketing rates of pretty much just the brutality of the logic of markets at work determining what human relations get to be. And that sets up a political question that I'm not exactly sure how to answer. But I think that the left accelerationist would want to posit some means of revolution, or they might forego the whole humanistic sense of capital bringing forth some sort of socialism as being human, as being something that is not even going to be manageable. So an example that I might want to mention with regard to that is there's this YouTuber, his name was Aldous Huxley, and he was talking about how communism is not going to be for like fleshy things such as us. It's going to be like for machines, essentially. That's kind of how radical he started going with accelerationist thought, with those regards. I'm not sure if you would call that communism per se. I'm by no means a communist. I know that Fisher pretty much was, but I don't think that just because I might not want to subscribe to someone's politics that therefore means that they haven't said anything useful. I don't think that's the case at all.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. I just want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, a very small number of early K-punk posts by Mark Fisher on antinatalism were apparently excluded, from compilations of his work by those that were putting it all together. I mean, his antinatalism was essentially censored. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that it's ultimately unfortunate that those writings might have been left out of his compiled works, especially in his work K-Punk, which you can get on Amazon. I think that some of the fear behind that might have been that, have you read like his essay on the Vampire Castle?
I don't believe so. No, I've heard of it, yes, but I have not read it. I
think that some of the concern with that might have been that certain leftist voices might have thought of it as being reactionary, or perhaps that it wouldn't support a sort of more inclusive and more humanitarian politics, as to say our social conditions are such that it's unethical to create more people and you should stop doing it. I think that upsets a lot of people on the left, and they frankly don't really want to hear it. And you can see this in this discussions when they start saying Malthus is wrong on things and they don't really have a good argument for it. So yeah, I hope that answers that in a sufficient way.
Cabrera comes up a lot in your videos, and I was curious how his ideas influenced you.
Yeah, so I remember watching one of his lectures on bioethics, which is cited in one of my videos. And then I read his book, A Critique of Affirmative Morality. And really what came from that was me wanting to understand a more continentally focused version of anti-natalism that might have been a little bit more separate from what I think Benatar's more analytic tradition of anti-natalism might be. And I just wanted to see how is it that you can combine certain continental thinkers. Like he pretty much opens up the book with Heidegger. And then he also quotes like, Schopenhauer as well, Jürgen Habermas, all sorts of people throughout the entire text. And I wanted to see how can it be taken in a much more phenomenologically radical sense. And he takes Husserl to be this radical thinker that could potentially push his more radical critique of what our social systems are doing and how we could potentially avoid the pitfalls of unjustifiably putting more people into said social systems. So for me, Cabrera is this sort of Argentinian critic that's going to push more radically the notion of what being gets to be in relation to what non-being is. And instead of like putting being in this very affirmative position that pretty much every philosopher ever, unless maybe if they're a pessimist, has been doing in the tradition for the past several thousand years, instead of putting that in the privileged position of trying to answer what it is, he's pretty much saying, well, in doing so, we've pretty much ignored this entire space of non-being or negativity, and that needs to be addressed because there might be a more hidden politics there that needs to be brought to light or might need to be investigated. And I think that he does a really interesting job of doing that with his critique of he does this critique of Leibniz' best of all possible worlds theodicy in the text, and it's pretty much like our go-to like atheist argument, like you have the problem of evil, and he's pretty much addressing this very subsect of several responses to the problem of evil put forth by Leibniz, and he's pretty much asking, well, if it is the case that God exists, let's put him on trial and see what justifications there could possibly be for making the quote-unquote best possible worlds, which is what we're supposed to experience as of late. Not necessarily looking at other people's objections to Leibniz like Schopenhauer, but he wants to make us think in terms of why would God need to have created this sort of suffering? And he goes into 3 different ways of how to pretty much categorize it. But to cut a long story short, he pretty much comes to the conclusion that just because like God might have made the suffering in a particular way metaphysically, like that suffering would have had to have been made metaphysically and separate from what being gets to be constituted as. So we could still possibly say that atheism is perhaps justified because God, there's no way that the Christian apologist or God can justify making being in this way, essentially. I guess if that makes sense. I know I kind of veered off into almost nonsensical philosophy of religion, but yeah, that's kind of what I'm kind of getting from Cabrera in that sense. And I also want to add that my my previous investigations into philosophy of religion do impact a sort of way that my channel gets to be in reference to these other thinkers as well. So I kind of have that sort of a basis in analytic philosophy of religion as well.
Okay.
Fascinating. Mark, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I guess you didn't have any other comments on Cabrera and how it shaped your ideas, eh? No, I was talking to Seven. Like, was there any other comments that you had about Cabrera that you want to put forth?
Oh, yeah. I remember watching the interview that you guys did with him recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there might be some sort of a misconception about what exactly it would entail if we perhaps had to intervene in people's lives to prevent them from procreating. I think that he might have been of the opinion that we would need some sort of a centralized state-like apparatus in order to ensure that there would have to be some sort of a logic to prevent people from being able to have children, whether that would be like a sterilization program or some sort of a eugenics sort of program or whatever. I don't really think that that would necessarily have to be the case. There could be more decentralized means of intervening in people's lives that might not necessarily have to rely upon rhetoric, and it might not have to be as centralized as a state-like entity. I mean, there are radical biohacker collectives that I think could do something with regards to some of the ideas in my videos, which would be like a sterilization disease of some sort. I don't think that's necessarily impossible to make, but you wouldn't necessarily need a state to get something like that to accomplish whatever political goal you might have with being an anti-natalist. And of course, I've had this debate or discussion with other anti-natalists before. There are people that disagree with me on that, and that's fair. I just want to take this in the most radical direction I can, pretty much.
How come?
Because I think that there's something to be found when we really push the boundaries of what we consider to be the ethical norm. I think that it uncovers certain things that we can investigate even more and try to see what other sorts of intuitions might we have about the world, or perhaps even if we're not even able to be justified in having intuitions at all, can actually be challenged. It's always a way to keep the dialectic moving, so to speak.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that's worrying about the rhetoric is when you're using this as a way to explore these topics and the knowledge, but also, which I think, in philosophy, we absolutely have to do that. But at the same time, the general public hearing about some of these radical notions, it sounds like these are policy-making decisions, and some of them may be, but from what I'm hearing is that you want to have the conversation, push the limits to find out what we can or cannot do. Is that correct?
Yeah, or to find out if there might be some stones left unturned that we might be able to eventually turn them to bring to more people's attention about something that they might not have even been aware of before.
Yeah.
But
okay.
yeah.
So I promise this is the last one, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about Nick Land. One of your reading suggestions that that you had was that I read Nick Land, which I did. I at least read Circuitries, which I found very interesting, certainly. He is, of course, an extremely controversial figure. I'm not 100% sure why or how he directly influences your anti-natalism. Can you speak a little bit about Nick Land?
Yeah, so from how I understand how the how Land fits in, I think that Mark Fisher actually did work with Nick Land, or he studied under him or something for a little bit. So I think that there is this overarching concern about what capital is going to do and what flows of money and flows of people and all sorts of, it's very like Deleuzian, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a bunch of concern about what sorts of feedback loop systems are we going to see, not only at the present, but also in the future. And at what point are these feedback loop systems going to perhaps reinforce certain notions of making procreation obsolete? You can already kind of see this in pretty much all of the global north, essentially, with the decreasing birth rates. I think that tells me that not only when women are given like more emancipatory rights from governments and whatever else, but also when you structure society in a way where it's becoming increasingly more difficult to sustain someone compared to a machine, we're running into a problem where we might not necessarily need to make people anymore at some point in order for whatever we consider this post-human or transhuman society to be, if we're even going to call it a society. Yeah. In Land, really, I think he takes that logic to like some of the most extreme points, with essentially a schizophrenitzation and breakdown of what we would consider to be like common language. He's speaking of like Quang contagion and all sorts of nootropics and all sorts of strange things in his piece Meltdown, which I think people should check out. But I think Meltdown pretty much represents what happens when there is nothing but capital for nothing more than the logic of capital. Mm-hmm. Your human sensibilities don't really matter. Our political systems pretty much don't really do much of anything but service capital at pretty much all facets. And even how we logically think about things or structures of whatever we call reality to be are movements of capital. Like your thoughts are capital. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, and I also think that Land fits into the discussion with David Pearce and the effective altruist. So I don't know how committed someone might be to transhumanism from going from like an effective altruist position. But let's say that you are, I think you're going to have to deal with these problems that I think Land wants people to engage with. And this is like earlier Nick Land. Later Nick Land, he kind of denounces his earlier work. I still think that looking at both him now and like what he wrote on his Xenosystems blog and looking at what he wrote that was compiled for Fanged Noumena, I think that both of those are worth checking out and doing like a compare and contrast, see what you agree with, what you don't, what you think is bullshit. But also put that in connection with other accelerationist spheres of the internet, pretty much. And that's kind of also how I think about anti-natalism. It's its own response to feedback loop systems. And in doing so, it becomes its own sort of accelerationist tendency, I think.
Can you describe why you feel that way about it? Why you think it's a feedback loop?
Yeah. I think that this kind of goes back into the more Deleuzian notions of cybernetics, but I also think that Land gets into the cybernetics sort of questions with circuitries and how we're making these like social systems, or rather, depending on how Landian you want to be, perhaps these social systems, like I remember in reading one of his texts, I think he compared instead of like your neurons creating the modes of what your thoughts are, he shifted the focus onto thought actually shifting or creating what your neural processes get to be. So in a sense, you could say that there might be like this germ-like horrific entity that forces certain entities such as ourselves into making capital or into forming history in such a way that it foretells the coming about of the inevitability of capitalism. And I think that coming out of that sort of a framework, we can see that these feedback loop systems are they're essentially going to cancel out depending on what type of commitments you're going to have philosophically. Like we can take, for example, Nick Bostrom and the simulation argument. Yeah, and the simulation argument. So are any of you familiar with that argument?
I'm afraid I'm not.
Yeah, so I think David Pierce actually, I think he did some work with Nick Bostrom, and they're definitely in discussion with each other on certain things. Okay. But pretty much the simulation argument pretty much says that, like, imagine that, like, there's some way in which a civilization can reach a certain point at which maybe it has enough computing power or technology or whatever to essentially make a simulation of the universe that it's in. So if you assume that sort of a position for how civilization might run its course, you run into two other alternatives as to why it seems like we're absolutely alone in the universe or whatever. So either no civilization reaches that point, which means they all go extinct at some point or something. They do reach that point, but for whatever reason, they decide not to make the universe into a simulation. Or the only other possible alternative would be we're already living in a simulation, which in my theory would mean that, like, or at least how I would understand Bostrom would mean that, like, we don't escape Descartes' first meditation. So if you think about those three alternatives, and you perhaps doubt that we're in a simulation and you don't think that a civilization would be able to get to that sort of a point because we should have encountered it by now, that leaves that the essential system that we live in as capital, which I think is a logic of how the universe works at some level, that means that it's going to lead to a human extinction. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that brings up an anti-natalist question of how exactly do we take care of human extinction, and what does it get to look like? Can it be ethical, et cetera, et cetera? So I hope that entire massive, like, almost nonsensical story makes some sort of sense. It's kind of experimental, and a lot of people are probably going to get mad at me and disagree with me and think that I'm cringe or whatever. Oh, like, oh, you didn't read this right or whatever. Oh, you need to read this. Yeah, whatever. I've heard it all before. I just think that Nick Bostrom, Nick Land, and David Pierce say something very interesting that I think anti-natalists need to be more aware of and be more inquisitive about.
Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and you can cut this out if it's not relevant. But I'm curious because, like, one of the other person who's sort of tied to accelerationism is, I think, Malthus Malbug. Is that right?
Mencius Moldbug?
Yeah, I think that's his name. Is that right?
Mencius Moldbug, yeah.
That's his screen name, right? What's his real name?
Curtis Yarvin.
Yes, him. However, you don't reference him at all. Like, is that because you disagree with him, or is he tied into? Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm not sure if I'm really committed enough of a neo-reactionary to reference him, and I don't think that neo-reaction is really consummated with an anti-natalist ethics. I think neo-reaction wants to group as much intelligent biocapital as possible to make more efficient societies, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, but I do think it's wrong if you need reproduction to make that happen, specifically reproduction of human and animal capital, seeing as it's going to make things suffer and die for its political ends. But I think that if you're some sort of neo-reactionary that might say, well, I just value overall, like, general artificial intelligence as the coalescence of what capital should be, then I wouldn't really have too much room to object, because you're not necessarily creating a suffering entity to have that sort of an intelligence boon, I would say. Lots of people don't like neo-reaction because they think that it's like too close to white nationalism, or they're like Nazis or something, but I don't think that's necessarily right. I think they make their own sort of compelling arguments for certain things, just like how I think certain people on the left do, but I think that everyone's politics has problems, so yeah.
As an accelerationist, how exactly does one do accelerationism? Like, is there things that you would be promoting or opposing in terms of, I don't know, how we're going in society or politically or economically?
Yeah, that's a huge part of the debate amongst people that are accelerationists already anyway. To me, it seems like they all have their own stab at that question. And that could mean anything from, we're still in control of capital in large degrees, we just have to be able to make sure that our politics can fit it, to there is no acceleration going anywhere. It's all just hydrocarbons going around and we can't really do anything about it. And you also have, well, there is no condition to what the process of acceleration is, kind of like land. I think he would say that, because I think he has said something like that, where there is no way of knowing what the process is. The process is whatever the outcome gets to be, pretty much.
And this is essentially why Mark Fisher said his famous phrase of, it's easier to conceptualize extinction than it is the end of capital. I'm paraphrasing, but
yeah, he's borrowing, I think, from, I don't remember if it's Walter Benjamin or it's Frederick Jameson. Yeah, he's borrowing from Frederick Jameson and saying that, like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Yeah. And that just goes back into his entire critique of where we're at with capitalist modernity or postmodernity or hypermodernity or whatever you want to call it. Even you can tell even with fiction. This goes, like, you know how I started off by saying, oh, I just got Cyberpunk and it's like fucking awesome. Like, the game, I love the game. There's some bugs in it that need to be addressed, but it imagines itself as if, like, the cultural logics of the 1980s into the early 90s, late 80s, kind of like never stopped. And it kept going on, from our perspective, 50 years into the future. Our culture and how we imagine fiction hasn't really been able to escape from how we are logically going to consider how society gets to be constructed.
Reminds me of Blade Runner.
Yeah, exactly. And this sort of phenomenon, Mark Fisher calls ontology, and he derives it from Jacques Derrida and his notions in Spectres of Marx. And he's talking about how we're always haunted by these ghosts of, like you said, like these retro ghosts of, like, Blade Runner or Terminator or synthwave or whatever. It's all like we've pretty much been on a time loop since, like, the late 80s, early 90s, and we haven't really progressed out of that, or maybe progress is wrong and it's an illusion. We haven't changed really much of anything is the point. And I think he said something to the effect of, we're still having, like, our modern politics, our modern political problems on, like, high-speed internet and flat-screen TVs. I think Fisher said that in Capitalist Realism. And one of the continued critiques of cyberpunk as a genre, not just the game, is that, cyberpunk doesn't really get us out of the sort of logics of capital that we need it to get out of. So it's a bygone genre, and If you want something different, we need to make something different. But that's not really understanding Fisher's argument, I think. I think that once we make it into an almost inescapable problem that I think Fisher has kind of made it into, I think it becomes more apparent that our notions of change might just be illusory. And of course, this is a very like fatalistic interpretation or reading of Fisher from my take. Other people are going to have more optimistic takes. They're going to have more takes saying, well, you need to read Acid Communism, even though like it wasn't exactly finished, as far as I can tell. But I probably should still read that and read some of the other stuff that might be out there. But I just don't see. I think if you want that sort of massive cultural change to shift out of how we imagined futures 20 years ago, you'd have to make those societal changes first, which no one really knows how to do as of late. Where we're caught up in the whole like the government should do it, corporations should do it debate, which I don't see any end to. But I mean, you have the naive people that think that fucking putting ballots in boxes or checking some marks on whatever sort of a ballot is going to solve their political problems, which is laughable. But yeah, that's kind of where I think I wanted to go with that question, if that makes sense.
I think we'd like to move the conversation towards the future of antinatalism, which I feel like sort of is a big hallmark of your work, is that you're one of the very rare antinatalists that wants to model what the future of antinatalism looks like. It's a very controversial topic among antinatalists, certainly, to even conceptualize that. And you provide a very detailed and articulate, perception of what the future of antinatalism is and the ways that antinatalism moves through the future politically, socially, and ethically. And to begin our discussion on all of this, I'd like to begin by discussing a video you made in January of 2020 called Anpara, or Anpara, I wasn't sure. Anpara was a fascinating video. Mark and I actually watched it together. I frankly think we both agreed with a lot of it, most of it. In your video on Para, you describe a future of antinatalism as being a position that discuss both the right, left, and center politically, that the left will essentially fail on accepting antinatalism, fail on recognizing the unefficacy of creating bodies, essentially, and that it will basically drive the right insane. And I can definitely see that we can expect that antinatalism will eventually be met with violent resistance from all sides, and that in this future, it would be best to arm ourselves and fight back. Can you tell us a little bit more about the position that you take in this video?
Yeah, no problem. That kind of stems from my ideas of how radical should antinatalism be politically. And from my survey of the political landscape, you can pretty much I think you can split politics into two broad ways, pretty much. Like a life history sort of politics based upon like an individual or group individual basis spanning one lifetime, namely yours or your collective lifetime. So that would be like, well, I only care about politics up until my projected age of death, which might be like, I don't know, 70 or 80 years old. So I might only care about politics insofar as I'm choosing not to commit suicide and I don't get hit by a bus or something, which, like I said, like projected lifespan, maybe 80-ish years or whatever. So I'm going to care about politics within that frame. You could also care about politics, which is where a natalist politics is going to draw much of its fervor from, which is a politics of futurity. It's going to care about these people are fucking insane. I'm going to say this up front because they don't know, or they're unaware or something that I don't know if they know this or not, but they're mortal. And if you keep making mortal people, it's not going to be the case that we're going to live forever. So it doesn't make sense to me to say we're just going to keep procreating indefinitely until everyone's dead. Mm-hmm. That's why I don't like futurity politics in that sense. That's pronatal. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But if you accept that even the left, right, the center, whatever you want to call yourself, they all vast majority accept that futurity of politics with how they want to change things in opposition to each other. Now, if you're an anti-natalist, I think you might have a politics of caring about what future people get to experience, but you don't have a politics of creating them. Whereas all of those other entities have a politics of what those people experience, and we need to keep creating them.
Yeah.
Which is totally at ends with what we would want ethically, right? And the whole arming thing, I mean, there have been historical examples of state regimes trying to enforce like bachelor's taxes and take away people's rights for reproduction or lack thereof or whatever, to enforce like birthing quotas for economic reasons. One example of this, I think, was one of the presidents, or quote unquote president, whatever you want to call him, of like Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu. And he wanted to enforce birthing programs, I think, in Romania, but it was met with harsh resistance. And he ended up, I think he got killed towards the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think he got killed, but that's just one example. Let's say that, like, I mean, we're going to put on our doomer hats and we're going to see how far we can go with this, because, well, the birth rates are already low across the global north. It doesn't look like there's really going to be any way of getting out of this. Countries have already tried to like put forth family programs for paying people to have children or having tax write-offs or whatever, but they're not successful. They don't particularly work that well. And a bunch of the right is saying this too. It's pretty much saying, well, if it's so expensive to have children, the state needs to cover those expenses, or they need to incentivize it. But that's not helping, because there are several states already doing that are not making their birth rates improve. So it can't just be necessarily the price. It has to be probably some other thing along with the price of raising children, along with what I said about them incurring too many expenses and so forth. But I do think that we should at least be armed and prepared just in case something like that does happen politically from either the left or the right. Because people have this sort of disgust within themselves, and you can tell with like people that admit to being sterilized. There's this stigma around sterilization still, like, oh, you're probably just a genetic defect or a dead end anyway. We probably don't want you to be procreating. You might as well just like put a hole in your head with like a 45 or something, right? But and I think a lot of that comes from a sort of like a racial hygiene protocol that a lot of people in politics don't necessarily want to admit to, but they definitely want to try to hint at. They want to try to say, we want certain people to breed, but not other ones, but we can't outright say it because some of the horrors of the 20th century came out of that sort of reasoning, or at least so we're supposed to think. But yeah, like, I don't think we need a centralized state apparatus. It could be as simple as you get a 3D printer and you start printing like lower and upper receivers for whatever weapon system you want. And there's this guy in Europe, his name's J. Stark 1809, most based man in Europe. And he started 3D printing his own weapons. So it's not like an impossible thing. If you want to buy on the market, I guess you could. If you don't want to do that, then 3D print them. And yeah, that's pretty much what I would say. And you can also buy plate carriers online that are kind of cheap, on the cheap end, depending on what you want to do. But yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to put it out there and say that I don't think that anti-natalists should be arming themselves. I mean, I in the context of the On Par video, you're just detailing a very extreme world that this would essentially happen in, where all social, protections are sort of gone, and we're living in this right-wing nightmare world. And then I sort of could see it. But leaving that aside for a moment, I guess I want to ask you sort of what you think about the current anti-natalist movement in relation to this, because if you are expecting anti-natalists to eventually get to the point where they arm themselves and swiftly oppose right, left, and center, all the while, at least the way that it's currently existing now, all of anti-natalists are frightened to keep a YouTube video up. I mean, I would say 80% of anti-natalists that make a video about antinatalism take it down. They're afraid to show their faces. They're afraid to talk about it with people in real life, often afraid to talk about it with people on the internet. So something pretty extreme would have to happen, I think, for antinatalists to want to take up arms. What do you think about that?
I think that in a concerted effort, like, we can clearly see where like our political or ethical opponents would be at in positions of power in that sort of a dystopian state of affair that you described. I would say that, like, we should definitely be armed. For right now, I would say we should probably be armed, but perhaps for different reasons, considering the global pandemic. And I don't know how topsy-turvy social order might be within the next year or two. Depending on where you're at, you still might want to be armed. I don't know. But yeah, like, I totally understand the sentiments of my fellow antinatalists when they're too, they have to exercise a lot more haste and caution about talking about these topics with people, because pretty much every society on the planet is pronatal, and they have it baked into the language that, like, if you don't reproduce, you're pretty much a failure, and it'd be better for the collective that you essentially perish in some way. Honestly, I don't feel comfortable showing my face or anything either. I mean, I'm talking behind some letters on a screen that you can see. I would say, however, if you make an anti-natalist video, I think that they all have some sort of value. So I would say, if you make one, maybe someone mirror it, or at least keep it up for as long as you possibly can, because that could be useful in our discussions. I don't think I've really seen an anti-natalist video that I thought was just, well, this is dog shit, or didn't have any value, or it didn't make me think about something in a slightly different way, even with taking on the anti-natalist stance. I think that people also need to get used to having these discussions, and they need to pretty much just know the ins and outs of how our arguments work. I think a lot of people are scared of getting into this topic because, like how Rivka Weinberg said in the previous interview, vast majority of human societies don't really talk about this subject, or they try to bury it under the rug or something. But no, I think it's very important. We just have to figure out our own logic of how our arguments work. And I think we're doing that very job with these sorts of podcasts, because you're getting a layout philosophically of the different camps and how our argumentation interacts with someone that would want to continue the human experiment until eventual oblivion. Mm-hmm. And I know that there is this disconnect in the community between the more, like, I watch YouTube, I'm kind of a casual anti-natalist, and the more philosophically rigorous sorts of debate style or rhetorical style that anti-natalists have. Honestly, that's a problem that I think that we're going to have to address, but we could do that with, like, Leith Malakrim's pamphlet and stuff like that. I don't think it's insurmountable. Like, you can memorize some of our arguments, or rewatch a video over and over until you memorize some of the more common objections to anti-natalism, and then how to reply to those objections.
Right. Well, I think there definitely are bridges being made, between the academic world and like the video world, or whatever we want to call it. I mean, definitely, probably more than any other time this year, that world is becoming more coherent, or meeting up more and having more discussions. I think, again, through things like this podcast and, if I may say, Anti-Natalism International.
When I think about the arming of anti-natalists, practically speaking, at least in this current time, I feel like the objections to the right and the left and any political affiliation that you have can apply to multiple ethical theories that you hold. I could say, heck, even vegans should, guard themselves. But as you said, like even with the pandemic, we don't know where things are going. But when and this is going to be a little bit of a shot at our own community, but when I think about our community, I feel like we'd be more likely to take a self-directed exit than protected thing, if you know what I mean.
I think we would. Yes, I think we would be more likely to literally become a death cult, a suicide cult, and kill ourselves and take up arms. I think that's what the current anti-natalist movement would likely choose, because I mean, just coming at this from I'm an ethicist, a more ethicist perspective. Anytime you get into some of these more truly controversial future perspectives on anti-natalism, it's an impossible conversation to have. It's met with just absolute confusion as to how any of this could be possible from an anti-natalist perspective, and I just sort of don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I understand that most of us are pro right to die. I am too. But I mean, if you're already considering that you're pro suicide, well, not necessarily pro suicide. I mean, like, you're already considering, if we were in that state of affairs, that you'd be better off essentially dying. Well, a lot of people that are anti-natalists are in a sort of state of affairs where they feel like they'd be better off dying it. They're still not doing it. And I see these posts on Reddit.
It's less that they're sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but just to clarify, it's less that about being a pro suicide stance or pro right to die than most anti-natalists are coming from a pro you shouldn't cause suffering perspective. And so the idea of having to kill people in order to, or even forcefully sterilize people in to defend our views, I just don't know how positively that's going to go for somebody that wants to see that happen.
And particularly the organizing part, because it wasn't just arming ourselves, but also organizing ourselves to like form a paramilitary, right? Like that was part of the video.
Yeah, that would come about under, like I said, like depending on what the global situation gets to look like. I think that could be practical and it might be necessary, especially for people that might not want to commit suicide. I'm kind of trying to think, like, I think that people that choose to commit suicide, I think that option should be respected. And I think that they should have access to that in a way that doesn't inflict pain upon themselves, or at least it should be the least amount of pain possible. But one of the things that I think comes out of more radical politics of how to understand this is that, like, people have political enemies, and sometimes those enemies are going to have to be dealt with in a way that would have to make them suffer. Otherwise, they will make you suffer. And this is a good segue into, did you guys read the Plato pieces that I told you about, Plato's Republic?
I have read Plato's Republic in the past. I read them in high school, so I'm foggy on a lot of the details because it was a while ago. I'm not sure if Mark has in the past as well.
I haven't, sorry.
Okay. So one of the problems that comes out of Plato's Republic is, how do we come up with like an adequate theory of justice? And what does justice get to look like? And what would a just society be? And all sorts of questions like that. And in one of the dialogues, I think it's in book 2 or book 1, I think Glaucon, Socrates, Thrasymachus, and some other people are having a discussion about what exactly is justice. And a Thrasymachian like view of justice would be that justice is the advantage of the stronger. That in a sense, you could say that like might makes right, or that whomever prevails over the weaker gets to make the laws of the stronger, or whatever you want to say that is. And I think a part of that view of justice means you might have to use force or violence in a way to enforce your own ethical standards upon other people. And a lot of the left, I think a leftist concern here would be that it could spark, or it would reinforce some means of imperialism. But of course, the reply to that would be, well, people have had violent resistance against imperial forces before. So they're still in this tension about what justice gets to be. Getting rid of your political opponents could totally be one way of ensuring that. And of course, a lot of that would be circumstantial. I'm not saying like, if you are armed and an anti-natalist, that's cool, but I'm not saying go out and like start harming and like destroying people that you think are your political opponents. I think you'd be doing a lot of anti-natalists a disservice, but also you would just be creating a lot more suffering than perhaps it would be necessary if we were under a more dystopian rule, I would think. I don't know if that really addresses the point, or if that's even satisfying. I think a lot of people are going to be unsatisfied with that answer, which is fair.
I am not 100%. I mean, how can I phrase this? I'm not necessarily 100% against the use of some force in some circumstances. Like, as I was saying before, I am an ethicist, so I believe that if the humans are on their way out, there needs to be some sort of plan to alleviate whatever other sentient life on the planet, the animals, of their suffering. I believe that's an act of euthanasia at that point, whether, it perhaps could be done in various ways, but even if it meant killing them, that it would be the right thing to do, because otherwise you are sacrificing them to the possibilities of natural extinction for an indefinite period of time. And I don't think that, again, on the road to human extinction, you come to the ethicist and vehement crossroads. I don't think the vehement path of allowing the animals to inherit the earth is the more ethical choice. I think so. I am not I agree with that. There are situational areas where perhaps this might be permissible. I just don't I don't necessarily believe that an anti-natalist paramilitary is going to have be the might is right, be in any position to take that kind of control, I suppose. Does that make any sense?
I think it would depend. A lot of this is kind of circumstantial.
Yeah, right.
I think that we would have to start to consider, though, at what point, let's say if we were in that scenario, right? Like the leftist or the rightist, whomever, because we're either reactionary or we're like too close to being communists, whoever wants to decide that. Let's say one of those camps gets power or something in some country, and there's no way for women to get abortions, and they're instituting like bachelor's taxes, and they're just doing all this stuff to make sure that families can keep being created. But let's say there's like a group of anti-natalists that don't want to commit suicide, yet they don't really have anywhere else to go. They would literally, I think, as an act of political necessity, they would have to choose violence if they wanted to continue to live in some fashion, otherwise be executed by these outside forces.
I feel like we may have exhausted this topic, but yeah, all I can say is I'm down. Like, I feel like this could go on for a while of exploring this scenario, because it is circumstantial, right? Like, and it depends on where we're at and where we could be, and also, what is antinatalism? I feel like people are going to say this isn't antinatalism, right? Like, we're talking about more of an extinction kind of thing, instead of just the procreative ethics part. You know what I mean?
And that's where I don't think it makes sense, though, because I think that there are real implications to taking on that anti-procreative stance.
Oh yeah, and I acknowledge that, but it's just until we're there, like, we're not in a dystopian setting yet. So,
but I think the problem is that you can't wait till you get there to theorize, because once you get there, you don't have any power to necessarily do anything else other than perhaps a violent revolt or something of that sort, if that's to be what happens.
Yeah, and I guess my only comment is just like at our present situation, I don't see a paramilitary anti-natalist thing being feasible or practical. In the future, it may be. I can't put myself in the future, but in theory. Did you have any other comments on it, Seven, though?
I wanted to readdress possible ways of maybe categorizing the future of antinatalism, and some of this is influenced by my present interactions with other antinatalists. So because I'm really cliche and I'm not really good at coming up with fictional ideas, I guess, I started kind of making this series called the Canticle for Benatar.
Yeah.
And it was in reference to this book called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which I haven't read, but because I like Fallout, I was inspired by this faction in Fallout called the Brotherhood of Steel. And they take reference from this wasteland faction called the Guardians, and they're also influenced from the book A Canticle for Leibowitz. And pretty much A Canticle for Leibowitz considers what would occur if some sort of a Catholic order, kind of like the Jesuits or Teutonic Order or whatever, were able to preserve technology and science in a civilization that's essentially crumbling back to something that looks like the Dark Ages. And that's kind of where I wanted to take antinatalism, because dealing with antinatalists, there's kind of like this two broad camps, kind of like how Christian monastics split themselves. So there's like a Cenobitic kind of camp, and like a Hermetic sort of, I don't know if you can even call them a camp, but there's like your Hermetic monastics that are kind of by themselves outside of the societies that they live in. They live by themselves, doing whatever they consider God's work to be, right? And then you have the more Cenobitic traditions that are going to be more communal. And good examples of this might be a bunch of people that are way more active on our Discord or ANI or something would be more Cenobitic, where someone like Inmendum or some other antinatalist that prefers to be by themselves would be more like a Hermetic antinatalist. And I wanted to see what would happen, let's say, in some dystopian scenario where society essentially collapses, yet for whatever silly reason that I'm not really good at thinking of, there are still anti-natalists in the future. So whether that means we succeeded or we failed in our mission, I'll leave that up to debate. But let's say there are going to be anti-natalists like 300 years in the future and society breaks down. And let's say you're at a point where the death rate is vastly superseding the rates of people being born. And there has to be a way to address like the closing of the species, I think, as what Amanda just suggested. How would that look? And to me, it's going to look something like a Canticle for Leibowitz. Okay. I think that people in those sorts of scenarios would, they're going to be people that are going to be more hermetic, which is fine. There isn't really a correct way of being a monastic in that sense, but the more cenobitic sorts of anti-natalists are going to rely upon a collectivity in order to manage their communities, especially if they choose not to commit suicide. So, yeah, that's where I would go with that.
Well, first of all, I do want to ask you more about the Canticle for Benatar later. Because I think it's a fascinating piece. I think you're a fantastic writer. I have to just say that. So it surprises me that you say you don't think you're very good at coming up with stories or narratives, because I think you are. But I'm just curious. I mean, do you get a lot of pushback against what you're saying in your videos? I mean, do you have a I mean, when ethicists talk about sort of like what the future of antinatalism looks like, or tries to push just even the conception of these ideas into a broad future, it's met with a lot of resistance and anger and all of this. But do you find any of the same kind of pushback to what you're saying?
Not necessarily. Most of my anti-natalist videos have been met with mostly positive responses. My most controversial video, of course, I think is on Para.
Yeah.
And you can go into the comments section of that video and look at my replies to that. I think I brought some of them up with regards to you and Mark and your replies.
No, that's okay. I'm glad that your work is being well received. I mean, for the obvious effort in it alone, and how articulate you are. So I'm not suggesting that I would hope people would take sort of an offensive view of it. I just think that that's very interesting, because in some respects it's more controversial, in a lot of respects even, than something that, say, ethicists would be saying. I mean, I for one, a part of On Par that I absolutely agree with is this idea that that antinatalism could be violently opposed. And I've talked to other antinatalists about that. And it's met with absolute confusion and shock and disgust that could even be a thing. But this idea that, if you're telling people to stop having kids, eventually you're going to go extinct, and that has real implications on economic systems and society. And so obviously it's going to create all of this anger towards all of these opposing groups. I'm not really sure what kind of question I'm trying to draw out of. I just find I'm just very curious about the reaction to your work, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, a part of my work is kind of preaching to the choir. But of course, like, if you're a person that's a positive utilitarian that doesn't think that antinatalism gets off the ground, or none of our arguments get off the ground, that's resistance. Like, they're not going to agree. We have irreconcilable differences about the value or disvalue of pleasure. So I don't really know what to do with that sort of a person, because I've talked with those types of people before in Discord.
Yeah.
And we pretty much just go in the same loop-de-loop of, well, you value pleasure this way and I do this way. It's like, okay, but I mean, what are you going to do with all your supposedly positive pleasure that you think you're committed to creating more of? Especially when I've already brought up that David Benatar has made a distinction between making happy people and making people happy, when when you're not necessarily making someone that is going to be a happy person just by virtue of creating them.
Right.
But whatever. I think that a portion of antinatalists, I think they detest violence, which, I mean, that's fair. Violence is brutal. It can be aesthetically disgusting and humiliating. And I think that a lot of antinatalists understand that, and they don't want to inflict that upon people. But like I said, like, as long as people can argue from a Thressomachian perspective of politics, I don't think that really upholds. I think that there are going to have to be times where you're going to have to make a decision. Do you value your own suffering or your collective group suffering more so than another collective group suffering? Do you think that they're the same? What about your own individual suffering? And no matter how you slice it, you're going to have to make a decision that somebody else might have to suffer more than your collective interests might allow for.
See, I think the pushback that I've seen or experienced or and I argue a very different thing. So I mean, I'm not saying that it's the same. It's a bit apples to oranges, but the reaction is generally not even so much of a disagreement about pleasure or any of this, and certainly not politically for most people, but more a how did we get here? We're talking about the ethics of procreation. How the hell did we end up here? And so it's it's a little bit of, Mark said something similar earlier.
Yeah, I get that from my videos as well, because I expanded onto other topics. And actually, I wanted to riff off of what you're saying, because with the ANI coming out, it kind of leads to, I've been really privileged on YouTube in this community because, for example, recently I had Life Sucks and Daily Negativity on. I don't agree with them, but we can come together and we can talk about these ideas. And I'm critical of Efilism and I'm critical of some of the conclusions Seven has, but we're able to have this discussion, and I'm glad that can happen. But I don't think that's the norm. Like, I don't think that's what's happening usually with antinatalism, and particularly you, Amanda. You've been involved for so long, and you've seen a different. So it's one thing to be like, okay, we're gonna map out where our disagreements are in terms of our premises and conclusion, versus a different type of opposition that I think you're hinting at, and how do we navigate that discussion? Because you can't just shut the discussion out, because it's inevitable, in my opinion. I am going to have to force to be talking about pro-mortalism, Efilism, child-free, vehement, like all of these
forever.
Topics. So what is the way to navigate that to where we can progress instead of self-destruct, so to speak? What do you both think of that?
Seven, would you like to go first? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. For whatever reason, like all of those groups that you mentioned, it seems like they have something in common. What that something is, I think for me, it has to do with production and like machinic forces of production, and how exactly people are going to become more aware of those sorts of forces. I think that you're going to have this lumpers splitters problem where, should we cast a very wide tent and say everyone's invited, or do we have our own little tight-knit communities that we each say, well, you can like speak in our community, but only under certain conditions, and then you can go to another community and speak about it. And those seems almost irreconcilable.
Yeah.
I would say we might have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Just about, and pretty much just do our best. I mean, ANI is doing, I think, is doing pretty damn well, and I think that our online organization's way better than what it was when I first started getting into antinatalism. So it's not like we're not doing anything, but we do need to have those sorts of discussions. Yeah, it presents itself as a political problem because we have to see what types of views that people are going to stand behind get to be excluded and which get to be included.
Right. Right.
I'll probably be in the cast a wide tent, everyone is invited camp. That's kind of what I'm in.
Yeah.
Because I think it allows for me to have discourse and investigate things I might not have thought of before. But somebody might think that that's threatening because it might invite hostile forces that might be against their own racial or gender politics or whatever from joining into that sort of a discussion in the first place.
Well, I think I can just say with ANI, I have tried to cast a wide net because I think we're at a point where it's necessary. I think the faction stuff is just not working, and we are of all these different schools of thought under one banner of whatever of antinatalism. And yes, there is this kernel of a similar thing that we agree with, but the details are all the hell over the place. And we need to fight it out. We need to have our arguments. We need to have our discussions. But I think that we're not going to be able to, we have to on some level realize that, we can't just fight amongst ourselves and expect to really get anything done, that natalism and all of these other issues sort of demand all of our attention. I mean, I think the only way for the philosophy to become more crystallized is to cast that wide net, perhaps a slightly tempered wide net. I mean, there probably are some things that really have no place. I just feel like we're at a point where it's necessary, and I realize how controversial that is. I mean, and Mendham for one hates the wide net idea, but I just think socially it's what has to happen at this particular point in time.
Yeah, my position is that it's inevitable.
Yeah.
I think there's different types of wide nets that you can place in terms of like a philosophical wide net or a social activist type of wide net. And I feel like if you're going to do a social activist thing, then yeah, you want to have those alliances.
Yeah.
And I think when we're talking about the philosophy, it's useful to analytically criticize, but not necessarily personalize it.
Yeah.
So like I am happy when people criticize me intellectually on my arguments, but
yeah.
I don't want to invite infighting. And thankfully I've been able to avoid that. I know for a fact people who follow me on YouTube disagree with me, but they write out a whole paragraph explaining all the points they disagree with, and I love that engagement, and I think that is healthy. And yeah.
Like, I don't want to encourage it. I'm sorry, I don't mean to go off on it, but I don't want to encourage infighting, but I think argument in the sense that, like, from my perspective, like, my introduction to the antinatal world was through response videos. So this healthy debate and back and forth, I think, is just so necessary. And it's a bit unfortunate that we've kind of lost that part of our antinatal culture. And so again, I think casting a wider net is part of what you have to do in order to sort of ensure that, because I think it is part of how this whole thing grows.
But yeah, I think that we also have to be aware of, like, one of the consequences that might come from casting a wide net might be a potential loss in the rigorousness of how we debate. It might become a bit more casual because a lot of our audience would be composed of people that simply watch the videos. They don't really necessarily engage with the literature or write their own arguments out necessarily. I mean, the best I can do with that is say, if you're an antinatalist, I think you should at least have read Benatar.
Mm-hmm.
The whole book, like, at least have read that. And that's really the only text I think you would need to say to have read in order to at least be what I would think to be a contemporary anti-natalist. And of course, some people might disagree and say, well, you should have read this other text that Benatar was referencing from Schopenhauer, or should have read this or whatever. But I think Benatar, with regards to like internet politics, he kind of put anti-natalism on the philosophical map, so to speak. So it's not like we can just abandon it or say like other things would be more politically efficacious toward our basic understanding of what anti-natalism is. I think his discussion with Sam Harris was probably the thing that got it more involved with social consciousness and how people are coming to understand it on the internet. And I mean, we are a fringe position, but like, just to put this in perspective, like there are about 4 times as many anti-natalists on our subreddit than there are on the Dark Enlightenment subreddit.
Yeah. So
it's not like we're smaller. We've gained a lot more people at least want to subscribe to our subreddit. And depending on how much you want to believe in what democracy is, like maybe that's good, because that means you have a majority or you're gaining more social traction, which is how democracy would have to work. Some might say that that's bad, and I can understand why that would be bad too, because like I said, it's potentially making it less rigorous, and it's filling it with more people that just say they're anti-natalists because of some other thing that they might have ran into in their life, instead of understanding what our philosophy entails, what the consequences of it are. So,
well, see, this is another. This is another reason why I think the wide net is important, and that's because, like, so I can't remember the name of the gentleman who conducted it, but Andreas Moss did put it in one of, I think, issue 2 of the Anti-Natalist magazine. There was a survey, of at least a bunch of the Facebook anti-natalist groups at the time. It was a few years ago. And the vast majority of anti-natalists had not read Benatar. So I think that what people understand about this philosophical position varies tremendously, obviously, as far as the schools of thought, but also what they're looking at. And so if you can cast a wider net that provides, for the purposes of providing resources to a wider spectrum of people, like, eventually we'll have Anti-Natalist Academy, where it's more of a centralized place to read these things online or discuss them online. I mean, I think that's, I just think that part of it has to come into play at some point, even if we, vehemently, no pun intended, disagree with each other.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome idea, because it provides people, I think it's awesome, but I also think that it could potentially have some problems depending upon how watered down we might have to make that sort of an approach. And that really depends on what our audience is going to be. Because I'm used to writing and talking about anti-natalism in a more academic context. Someone that might not be involved in academics, that might be more of a layman, might have a problem with trying to understand some of the more sophisticated logical operations that might have to happen when you want to prove a certain conclusion to be the case from certain amount of true premises. I guess like what you could say is it's a happy medium between the more rigorous anti-natalist arguments and it being just the videos that are more common to the layman. I think that the Anti-Natalist Academy could also be an awesome point toward pointing people toward our literature and what to read and how to respond to certain arguments. I think that what we're going to look at is it's going to mirror like Christian apologetics in a certain way. But I think because we're creating a system of replies and responses that people can simply remember without necessarily having to read the literature, even though I would totally want someone to go and read the literature. Like a lot of the arguments that you see, like with certain people, like they memorize apologetics from listening to it on YouTube. But if you ask them, like, well, have you read like this person, like, I don't know, Van Til or Van den Wagen or Plantinga or whatever, or William Lane Craig, it's like, oh no. Or no, I did read them. And it's like, oh, well, did you read this reply? It starts to go back to like philosophy of religion, or it starts to kind of look like those sorts of discussion topics.
Well, see, I guess the point I'm making is I think we're at that now. I think we're at that level of disorganization and not necessarily, I mean, a huge number of antinatalists speak in memes only. You know what I mean? So it's
oh yeah, and then the meme problem, the memes.
Yeah, so it's
just water stuff down. I don't like.
Right.
I mean, memes can be funny jokes, but I think that they're really annoying, and
I hate them.
They're really meant for lay people. They're made in such a way to guarantee some sort of an affective reaction from someone, like an intense reaction
right.
from someone, just by reading like 2-3 brief sentences or phrases with a picture, because the meme wants you to realize that there's like a subject of the meme that you can relate to, like the Wojak meme. Like everyone thinks they're a Wojak meme or whatever, yet like everyone supposedly thinks they're an individual with like the Chad meme, and then they start to relate to the Wojak meme, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. I thought you said you were an individual. Why are you all saying you're a Wojak? But a lot of them are just overused over and over, and they keep going through this sort of logic of just being kind of the same, but in little variations that are supposed to make you upset, or they're supposed to make you feel good about yourself by reinforcing your own like potential biases or whatever. And then they have a meme for people that like, go on the internet and they just get upset by the things that disagree with their own intuitions. And it's like, what does this add to the discussion?
Right.
Not really much of anything. You might feel good or bad, but they're just internet drawings with some like pithy sayings. And I think that's also a good way for people to politically justify their own in-group versus the out-group and all this other stuff. So yeah, it's like a mimetic culture.
I think it's very corrosive. I mean, I at some point you got to actually start talking, and so that's, I don't, but I think a large number of ANs defer to that culture. So, I definitely think a big part of what needs to happen is just making resources available to people, and through translation, and especially since we are trying to operate on a very international level, there's lots of material that's just not available to a huge spectrum of the human race. Benatar is not in a lot of languages, even where there's a pretty big antinatalist contingent. Like, there's no Arabic translation.
I just want to say
that's fair.
Selfishly, I totally agree with the translation stuff. There's so much antinatalist material that I would love to read, but it's in other languages that...
Yeah, Cabrera, for one. I mean, lots of Cabrera is not in English. Yeah. So you talk a lot about involuntary sterilization in your videos. I just was curious if you could describe your position on this.
Yeah. I think there might be two big ways to think about it. There's like the anti-natalist, like all ethnic groups, all political groups, whatever, should be sterilized. And then there could be like a more eugenics-based notion that I think someone like David Pierce might be willing to bite the bullet on, or even say, well, if it means that like more people being born would suffer less, then perhaps some means of eugenics could be justifiable. But I think that what Pierce wants is, I think he wants like some sort of a positive eugenics, where there might be gene editing of people and of their genetics such that we could essentially get rid of any sort of genetic condition or disease that might put someone's hedonic set point at an unacceptable level for much of their life. And I think that even though Pierce might be engaged with that sort of eugenics thought, he might not necessarily be committed to my more radical take of involuntarily sterilizing massive groups of people, which I am aware that Rivka Weinberg did suggest that there would be an ethical cost to not procreating. I don't know what that cost is, but because it is interventionist, like in the Cabrera sense, there opens up a political landscape where you're pretty much telling certain people, we don't need your gametes, but we might need some other people's gametes. And I also think that in another sort of scenario, let's say you're absolutely disgusted with humanity, like you're extremely misanthropic. I think that the involuntary sterilization idea kind of appeals to a sort of schadenfreude that people have with their societies as of now. Us as anti-natalists were like, thank fucking God we didn't procreate into this garbage, because I could not live with myself with putting someone into this sort of a society. And if you say something like, well, wouldn't it just be better if pretty much everyone on the planet or whatever minimum population would be necessary to be sterilized in some way such that the human species couldn't reproduce? It would be kind of like a wish. Like people would legitimately want that. As for my opinions on it, it would be kind of like a blessing. I think that a lot of people don't want to acknowledge. They don't want to sit there and think of, well, if I don't procreate, one, I wouldn't have to be obligated toward making a specific entity that's going to suffer and die, but also that you're preventing a bunch of suffering as well in doing so. And it kind of really wants to take that sort of negative utilitarian to task. Like, how committed should you be to wanting suffering to end, along with an anti-natalist concern for stopping procreation to the point where it might be ethically justifiable to intervene in billions of people's lives to make it such that their gametes can't work anymore? And what would be the disastrous consequences of that? Or would it actually be more beneficial? And I'm pretty much in the more beneficial camp. I don't agree with putting people in camps to do this, though. Even though if people are put in camps and they are sterilized, it might be good that, hey, they can't make children anymore, but they still suffered in prison-like conditions that needs to be addressed still. And I wouldn't really want, like I said, I wouldn't want a central anti-natal state to do something like this. So yeah, because we would be making a bunch of people pretty much suffer and die into torturous conditions. But if you were able to do it in a way where you wouldn't have to put anyone in prison or torture them, I don't see necessarily a problem with that. Is that clear as mud?
I think so. Mark, do you have anything you want to say?
Still processing.
Yeah, I kind of am too. Yeah.
Because when forced sterilization comes up, I'm thinking of it as an anti-speciesist framework. So people will automatically think about what has been done in the past, but in my framework, I'm thinking, well, we already do forced sterilization. We do that with animals. So what does it look like in terms of technology, and what would be an ethical position be? And I think you addressed most of it, like, a centralized government doing this, forcing this on people in cages would be bad. So I'm with you on that. I just, and practically, if anybody's trying to infringe upon people's bodily autonomy, I mean, like, you're just asking for war, in my opinion. And that's just going to cause even more suffering. So practically, I don't see that, that coming about. I guess what you're hinting at is like this biohacking thing. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that the war, it depends on how it would be done. Like, that gets into the specifics of, like, I even say in my videos, like, if a state were to make some sort of a disease capable of sterilizing massive amounts of populations, people could potentially see that as like a weapon of mass destruction in some way, right?
Yeah,
Which could
politically
potentially,
that would be seen that way. Yeah.
yeah. But if there if it's like some decentralized cell or group that does it and they don't have like a state centralized authority, it'd be extremely difficult to say we need to go to war for like a state to declare war upon that group, especially they can't really find them. So it gets lost in the specifics of like, how would you pull it off? What would be necessary? And it becomes very speculative. But like with regards to biohacking, I think that there's some promise there. It's very decentralized, and it doesn't seem like the state really knows how to handle biohacking. It's kind of in the same parameters of like file sharing and like 3D printing your guns. Like they don't know what the fuck to do with files as soon as they're on the internet and people can have access to them, because no one's really gone out of the way to ban the entirety of the internet. Like even China, like, yeah, they censor it and stuff, but there's still ways around that they haven't been able to necessarily counter. They might threaten you with some authoritative rule, like, well, you have this software on your computer if they do an investigation and find it. But I mean, there might be software that could counter such activities. So I think that the main question would be, in the same Cabrerian sense, would an anti-natalist biohacker be ethically justifiable in making a disease that could sterilize billions or millions of people? And if they were to come in contact with such a method of doing so, why should they not take those sorts of matters into their own hands?
I want to just build on top of that, particularly with you, Amanda, because I remember when I met you, this was actually one of your things that you talked about in terms of at least sterilizing wildlife. And then when we talked to Benatar and then you talked to Menhem, kind of changed the position on that because they didn't think this was practical. But I am not as dismissive of it as at least as a technology. So I'm curious what your thoughts. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I know I'm okay with some forms of sterilization. I don't know total, because there would be some after effects that might be even more detrimental. But that aside, I'm just curious about, after talking to Benatar and Menhem and like, what's your position on this now, especially with what Seven is saying as well?
I mean, so I mean, previous to those two interviews, I was much more of the belief that there were all these other options as far as, how to cause sentient extinction, so to speak. And so I'm still not opposed. I mean, if we are to take anti-natalism, ethilism as the largest, human projects, I can't really say that we necessarily already at this point in time know all the answers for what might be possible as to how to make these things occur. So like, maybe there is a means of ethically sterilizing the human and animal populations in the interest of achieving extinction. But I was shocked when both Benatar and Menhem did not believe that that was the case. And as far as the animals, it at least for the time being seems like, unfortunately you may, euthanizing them may be the only option. I personally am always open to what other options may be out there. I think that should be an ongoing project of anti-natalism is what technological whether it's through biohacking or I don't know, honestly. I don't know enough about the science of any of this to really say, but if other methods are out there and achievable, then sure, that cause what I'm only interested in whatever causes the least amount of suffering. At the same time, I really worry that a lot of these alternative methods are worse than death. I got into a very heated discussion with somebody who, thought that, the alternative to, say dropping an atomic bomb on the remaining animals after, or near human extinction would be, the grossest, most malevolent, most awful thing. But he did sort of want to do this, putting them all in cages and, gradually altering their genetic makeup and all of this stuff, which feels so much more invasive, so much more, so much uglier. So I don't know. I guess what I would say is that I very much do not want to see methods employed that that create living hells. I would much rather see it end quickly than this drawn out, nightmare scenario for the end of sentient life on this planet.
So I remember you changed your position after Benatar and Affirmative.
Yeah.
And I understand why, because like they're both objecting to this. But like I think just after those interviews, I sent you an article about they were doing stuff about reducing mosquito populations.
Sure.
And like I don't know if this could be scaled up, but if they're already making, certain populations of a type of animal to be sterile, then I think this has animal rights implications as well, because we don't like culling animals, right? Like a lot of people object to that. Okay, well, what's the alternative then? Well, we could we could sterilize certain populations of animals so we could help the ecology of the environment and stuff like that. So there's ways where environmentalists, anti-natalists, and animal rights people can all collectively agree on at least certain contexts of sterilization. So, you'll avoid those deaths and stuff like that. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think we do need to talk about the ethics, but first of all, is it even do you see it as still a possibility, a method that could be employed, compared to like when I remember from Benatar, it just seemed like it seems unpractical. No, and I'm like, well, I don't think I agree with him on that right now.
Well, okay, so I'm sorry. Yes, so like I remember the video that you sent me, and it was about the mosquito populations. I just don't know. I mean, I am not a scientist, so I can. I'm not against the possibility of whatever methods we can come up with, whatever. I mean, my bottom line is whatever is the most ethical method of sentient extinction, I'm perfectly happy to embrace. Even if it's a collection of methods, which I assume actually it might be. The issue that I took with the mosquito video, which was a phenomenal video and it's a brilliant experiment, was that it's sort of, and I could be remembering it wrong because it has been a number of months, but it sort of seemed like in order to decimate that population, you would actually have to duplicate the population first, right? Because you had to
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, you had to create, I think, as many mosquitoes that you're trying to make sterile.
Yeah,
and then they all die.
Right. Yeah, the method there would be like not an antinatalist one, but I
well,
guess
but also in terms of practicality. I mean, how are you going to do that with every type of animal on Earth?
Right. So like, I don't think we're there yet.
Definitely not.
But
no,
I think
right.
I see a light, so to speak. Like I could see something at the end of the tunnel. 7, theoretically, like, do you think it's like, I'm assuming you think it would be possible. But we don't have the technology now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily impossible. I mean, we've already made synthetic diseases before. Like we've either taken diseases and modified them in such a way that it fulfills our interests, even though those interests might be horrific and used as like biological weapons. But I don't think that is necessarily impossible. I do think that Amanda does bring up a great point where at what point are we theorizing, and at what point do we have to look at like reality and admit like, hey, your theory might be really cool, but atomic weapons seem to be the most clean-cut way to do this, rather than potentially having to, like in the mosquito example, create another generation of mosquitoes to make all the other mosquitoes sterile, or to wipe them out or whatever.
And how many human populations and animal populations do we have to go through to get to those solutions? So how many generations are we going to sacrifice for this pretty distant, maybe possibly impossible sterilization, method, which may on its face look more ethical, but it isn't as, I would argue, isn't as necessarily ethical, at least speaking for animal populations, as, ending it in some more swift manner.
And I think that I think that if you're talking about stopping the procreation of things, like literally some part of some animal species has to gestate some sort of part of the species to give birth to it, I think that there is a way of having an anti-natalist discussion with that. Whereas if we're talking about using atomic weapons, I think we're getting into like, that's sort of like the red button sort of territory, in my opinion, which I think is an awesome discussion to have. And I think that that kind of goes in line with how are we going to define reduction of suffering, and how committed to some view of utilitarianism or care ethics or whatever you want are we going to be as a reply to that question. And I do think that if you are more practical and you might be more of a vulgar realist, which, hey, more power to you, and you might say, hey, this sterilization disease idea sounds really cool, but you know what they say about Icarus? He flew too close to the sun and look what happened. You need to look at what's going on around you practically, which is people have made nuclear weapons that could blow up the world several times over. So why not use it? And at what point does sacrificing like practicality become an ethical problem? And at what point does the necessity of being able to use some sort of a practical way of achieving an ethical end actually like defeat the ethics in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Because like there was this one argument I got into with someone in Discord where they said, well, you could try to use nuclear weapons all you would want, but there's still life in the very dark reaches of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So how would nuclear weapons fare in that sort of a scenario when they're not going to be as effective as when they're used on land? And it's like, well, to be fair, I think that we're still learning a lot about our oceans anyway, especially when you start talking about depths that are that deep. You start talking about things on the planet that look like they would belong on some other planet. They look like an alien almost. But if you wanted to end even the suffering necessitated by nature in those deep environments, you might not want to use nuclear weapons because they wouldn't be as effective at those depths. So that begs the question, well, what would you use? Because those are still wild animals and they still suffer. Like an anglerfish might be hideous, but I think it still has a nervous system and it still suffers and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Throw the planet into the sun. I don't know. Well, but the other thing I want to bring up is, as far as animal populations go too, there's the other argument that I've gotten into people with is that, in these sterilization ideas that come about, there's sort of this, what is sometimes thought of as like the myth of balance, that you can't necessarily do this for individual populations of certain species without causing just massive amounts of more chaos than you would if you were to do it swiftly. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but I mean, that's something that I've heard people bring up a lot, that there really just is no way of not creating chaos by, let's say, starting with the mosquitoes and then going on to antelope, or
like some type of butterfly effect of
yeah.
I think we do these interventions anyway. We're
but not on an extinction level scale, on a gradual course of time. So yeah.
And for me, for my answer, sorry, Seven, is like, I think about our rates of growth right now in terms of reproduction, and it's globally across all countries, it's going down. And we have the sociological evidence of what contributes or what correlates to these declining populations. And I think I may not get an anti-natalist utopia, but less sentient beings, the better in my view of reducing suffering. So I'm just going to advocate for those things that have been shown to correlate with working and reducing populations, without going into the red button. I think that's something we could all agree on. What do you think?
I think it depends on how you want to read the trend. Because I think on Wikipedia, when I started reading about it, it estimated if trends continue, we could potentially go extinct in about 300 years. If everyone keeps going down, just the birth rates keep going in the toilet, which, hey, that's cool. But we would still have to think of what's the last generation of people going to look like and how are they going to handle this? And I think we'd also have to ask the question, the way that these birth rates are plummeting is pretty much through the flows of capital. It's through flows of people demanding more things because capitalism allows for more productive forces to meet more and more people's needs. And when that happens, people think they don't really need to reproduce anymore. So that kind of begs the question, how much capitalism should we have and enforce on the biosphere? Because it's making animals suffer and die. And it's also, it's fucking up people's societies and environments as well, with further ecological problems that we're causing economically. But what should we value more? Should we value, well, we're making a global system where people are becoming more unlikely to want to have children, which is good, but we also have to face the fact that there's a lot of suffering that's going on with this acceleration of techno capital that's going about. And it seems to me that, like, once you have like have you guys seen the Bricker and Ibsen talk called Empty Planet, like the global population decline?
I don't believe so.
No. I haven't. No.
Okay, so they're demographers, and they pretty much disagreed with the UN's estimates of population growth. The UN thinks that we're okay, but yeah, the UN is still pretty much of the opinion, as far as I know, of that we're probably going to reach about 11 billion people toward the end of the century. But Bricker and Ibsen suggest we'll probably reach somewhere closer to 7 or 9 because of 4 big factors that they noted with regards to, like, emancipating women and them demanding more political rights.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too.
And
yeah.
more access to birth control, decline in religiosity, and more and more people living in urban environments, like moving from like farms and traditional societies into urban centers. And it doesn't seem like there's really going to be a way to stop that from what I've looked into. But if you are an ecologist, right, you're going to be in a weird position of somehow saying people are the cause of all this environmental degradation, which I think we are in large part, but also we're going to need the very tools of environmental degradation to limit the amounts of people that would be formed that would be created, born in the first place to bring about the environmental degradation. But I think that maybe Rivka Weinberg, I think, probably brought up a good suggestion with like, not having children isn't enough. It's very good, but there might need to be other ways of being more conscious of what we're doing that might not necessarily have to rely upon it being only necessary and sufficient that we stop having children in order to limit our impact on the biosphere. Because I mean, even just reducing the amount of meat that you eat, or even going vegan, you probably should go vegan, right? Reducing like your carbon emissions, all of that stuff is really important too. And I would say probably not having children in combination with lots of those other things would be what someone that's involved with an anti-natalist ecology would want to try to find.
Seven, was there a direction you wanted to take the last bit of this?
Aesthetics seems all right with me. Yeah. My first few video thumbnails, they were inspired by H.R. Geiger, and I think that his work called the Birth Machine. Mm-hmm. It just made so much sense as to why anti-natalism would be surrounded by that sort of an artistic piece, because I think that the piece represents the literal firing of like a gun. Mm-hmm. that procreation could be considered as. You're literally shooting someone out and you don't know what's necessarily going to happen to that person. Same way if you fire a round, I mean, you can aim, you can have an idea of where the round is going to go, but you could miss. The round could go anywhere. It could ricochet. It could do potentially anything. The gun could jam. You don't know. So it very much, it just makes so much sense as an analogy of how we would view procreation as like a gamble with your hazardous materials or your gametes, pretty much. And then I started to go for a more direct style of aesthetics, where I kind of just wanted to put like what the general idea of the video might be of in some of my videos, as a text for my thumbnails. And then I went and I downloaded GIMP and Blender, and I learned how to use those programs. And I was able to copy the image from, I think it was the Vehement website or whatever. And they had the Ouroboros with a sword going through it. And I thought that was just way too badass to pass up. So I had to make it look even cooler. And I know that the artist that made that's on the Vehement website, I think he's Indonesian. I forgot his name, but if you go through my Reddit history, I did make a shout out for him because I posted a cool GIF that I made in Blender on Reddit about it. Really talented artist though. And I decided, well, what would it look like in a pure virtual environment where it's not even sure if bodies are even relevant, yet anti-natalism still exists in some fashion. And that's kind of what I kind of wanted to go with that sort of like virtualization of anti-natalism and the virtualization of our symbols, pretty much.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Yeah, I mean, I really do love the visual language that you're creating and working with in your videos. Can you tell me a little bit about the significance of like Blade Runner and Apocalypse Now and Akira, which is one of my favorite movies? And even Game of Thrones, is that what it's called? Yeah. I think it's fascinating that you're connecting your thoughts to some of these, more well-known pieces of media.
Yeah. I think a large part of my project is a techno-occultism.
Yeah.
So I still want that to be a part of my radical critique of whatever we're going to consider modernity to be. And I think that a good way of looking at that would be the ethical conundrums coming from cyberpunk as a genre.
Mhm.
And that's where I think Blade Runner and Akira come in. I also think that dystopian fiction, specifically like dystopian 70s, 80s movies, drive that aesthetic as well. They provide a sort of cognitive space, so to speak, for you to consider societies that run off of seemingly differing logics from what we culturally run off of.
Yeah.
Yet we could still imagine it in a way that we would think like, oh, our society is not dystopian, theirs is dystopian, when really, like, have you seen this show called The Man in the High Castle on Amazon?
I have not, no.
Oh, it's a fantastic show. It's a fantastic series.
Yeah.
But long story short, it's pretty much a series considering like alternative history. Like what would happen if the Nazis won World War II and America lost? Is pretty much what The Man in the High Castle is trying to address.
Yeah.
And they're pretty much trying to have you see like our idea of a dystopia could be very different from somebody else's idea of what a dystopian society could be. Because in The Man in the High Castle, if you're a Nazi and you won World War II or whatever, you would think our society is dystopian.
Right.
And they address this in the show with people being able to travel between our world and their world and all this other stuff. Spoilers, sorry.
That's okay.
And it really begs the question, is their world a dystopia or is our world a dystopia? And certain people would even have a more radical social critique and to say, our world is dystopian enough as it is already. Because people pretty much go to work until they die, and they're so scared of not working, they don't know what else to do because they don't want to be homeless or whatever. So now we have a whole economic and social and ethical problem with regards to homelessness, and how would people want to solve that as a problem? Is it solvable? I don't know, I'll let other people decide that, but I also think that Akira especially deals with topics of the singularity. And David Pierce, right? He categorized the singularity, like what people are referring to as a singularity in the literature as like an intelligence explosion, or like a change in radical well-being, or what was the third one? Like a change in radical life extension, right? Not extinction, but extending your life, right? And Akira, I think, represents the sort of fear that people have of radical changes in society that happen without any sort of way of predicting it. Like at the end, I think Tetsuo, he becomes consumed by whatever those people in the lab are working on, and it explodes all of Neo-Tokyo. Something totally radical without any way of being able to control it occurs, and there's nothing people can do about it but speculate. And I think that if you fit anti-natalism into that, it could possibly mean that the obsolescence of birth might have to make way for a singularity event to occur, especially if it's more cheaper and more effective to have a machine doing everything that a person would do rather than make a person in the first place. So, and I mean, machines, I don't know how transhuman you want to be, but some people might make the argument that machines are already smarter than us anyway, at least collectively. But even if you don't want to make that the case, I do think you would have to say that there is going to be an even more intimate relation with machines that people are going to have in the upcoming decades that I don't think should be ignored. And I think it's going to have interesting political and social consequences that are in the same sort of sense, in the same vein of Akira as being unpredictable. So, yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. That's fascinating. related to aesthetics, but moving into just a slightly different thing. I mean, just addressing a Canticle for Benatar, which is your piece of creative writing that's you've been putting up on your channel. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating piece of work. I'm excited to see where you go with this. Two questions about it that I had was, I mean, as Benatar is in the name, I mean, is this something that you plan on sending to him at some point, or that you want his feedback on?
Oh no. Well,
Okay.
I mean, if he wants to give feedback, that's awesome. I think that'd be fucking incredible if he were to look at that and say, hey, you're full of shit here, or this is really cool here. I think that'd be awesome. The Benatar aspect was really just to replace Leibowitz and still have that sort of post-apocalyptic, sort of like, I call it like a crisis, or like a like apocalyptic Catholicism, or like an like an eschatology that rises from ethical problems, and it essentially having a power structure that's going to resemble some form of Catholicism.
Okay.
Because I think that power structure has been in Western culture for so long that we don't really know how to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be there in that apocalyptic sense. And I think Fallout's Brotherhood of Steel, or the Guardians from Wasteland, or whatever sort of like, have you seen the movie Priest?
No, although I've been meaning to. It's been highly recommended. Yeah,
I haven't seen it either, but just like the concept of that is just so interesting, because even Priest is extraordinarily Christian. Mm-hmm. Like they're killing vampires. It's a post-apocalyptic or dystopian future. They're killing vampires.
Yeah,
but there's still like this vestigial like Christianity that's still apparent.
Right.
I'm by no means a Christian, but I do like some of the aesthetics that does come from Western tradition in that sense. So yeah.
Okay. Do you have any interest in releasing the text of these videos as a book at some point? Like, publishing a book? With a lot of your writing, to be perfectly honest with you, I mean, your video essays could easily, I think, be a
or even like a blog.
Yeah. Personally, I just want to say, before you say anything, I'd love to have text versions of so many of your videos.
Ditto.
I think it'd be a project I don't have access to some of the texts of them. They kind of got destroyed a little bit.
Oh, okay.
From what I can do, I could try to transcribe as much as I can. And this is going to be an ongoing process. I don't really have a due date for anything that I upload. I just kind of go, I should upload a video, or I don't feel lazy, I'll do it. But I think that if I were to transcribe them and maybe put them on a blog or get them published, it could be awesome.
Yeah, I think it'd be very worth it, Seven. I really do encourage you to do that. Obviously, I know it's a giant undertaking, but I think it'd be an important way for people to engage with your work, especially because, well, one of the reasons being, because you do have so many fascinating references, and I find myself watching one of your videos, like constantly having to jot things down, and I've heard it in your video and nowhere else. So it would be, just for reference guide to your world alone, I think that it would be, that'd be very helpful.
I agree with Amanda, but like, no pressure, buddy.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, I don't mean to suggest get on that now, but I ask this question of pretty much every guest that I have, and then perhaps we can close out unless Mark has something else that he wants to get through. But would you mind giving me your thoughts on what are sometimes considered the four schools of antinatal thought? Just child-free, antinatalism proper, vehement, and ethylism, and specifically where sentiocentric antinatalism fits into your concept of the future of antinatalism?
Yeah, so I think all of those philosophies or schools of thought want to critique the very way that civilization has been running ever since people have been writing something down. Mm-hmm. Even child-free want to say we shouldn't be made fun of or thought of as genetic dead ends because like they either refuse to get pregnant or refuse to impregnate someone or whatever. Mm-hmm. But like if you live in a politically charged environment, which pretty much every society has, and they tell you, well, there's some other that might come and take you over, if you don't outproduce those people with children or weapons or something, you're going to be living under their rule. So you politically have to make a decision about if you're going to do it or not. I think just giving the finger to that reasoning is just really awesome, because you're pretty much telling those people you need to figure out a different way of having this occur without having to force people to be born, or you need to like do something else politically with regards to how society is going to be created or how we're going to keep reproducing it. Vehement. I like vehement because I wonder how many of them would like Pentylincola and kind of like lifeboat ethics. Because I think that what vehement does, I view them as like, I view them as an ecological movement. They're very much about how we're more or less a cancer on the planet. And they take that sort of notion from deep ecology, which is fair. Because when I studied philosophy, there was this guy, and he kind of got me into deep ecology a little bit. Like, I've heard the argument that like we're a disease, which we pretty much are, not only just the environment, but to ourselves too, I would debate. But if it is the case that we are essentially a disease on the planet, greatly reducing our numbers could be potentially beneficial, even to the point of making the human species extinct, if you care about the environment over and above our sort of like social conditions that would be necessary in order to live on the planet. Which, I mean, there could be a problem there with capitalism. Because like I said, like one of the best ways to make people not reproduce, so it seems, would be you give them some neoliberal capitalism and they stop doing it. So, but in order to do that, you're going to have to degrade a lot of the environment, so it seems. And then again, like maybe you could have some sort of a green movement coming from that would be anti-natal. I don't know. I think there's a lot of possibilities with that. And then, what was the other? Oh, Effilism. Effilism, I think they take, they're not only speaking about how societies are produced or how animals have to kill and eat each other in order to survive. So suffering has to be built into the pretty much the like the Darwinian sort of matrix that we find ourselves. I think they're taking it to a much more cosmic scale, which is interesting. I think they're saying that there's like some cosmic level of suffering that inevitably occurs when you find sort of conscious beings such as ourselves in this sort of a universe.
Well, just on Earth. We're just really concerned with Earth.
Yeah. Sure, we'll keep it. I mean, I've had the discussion where it's like, well, what if you found space aliens? And you're like, oh shit, space aliens. Oh, what do we do with them? What if the space aliens are Effilists too? You don't know that. So we'll see. I think they're just making a lot more of a cosmic, like a claim about the cosmic sort of suffering that we find. It becomes like cosmic horror. And I think that sort of thinkers like Ligotti kind of get into that. And I think Land even touches upon that, and Ray Brazier as well. So I think that if you're an Effilist, I think you should probably look into like Eugene Thacker and Ray Brazier and some Nick Land to learn about like sort of a like nihilism that could be like a space for people to speculate in, and to see how dramatically you can make suffering look to the point where just with your words, not only will you make people not reproduce, but you'll also make people want to make sure that other animals don't reproduce as well. So, yeah, I have nothing really against Effilism. I don't really know where I would really start. So I don't know if I'm really necessarily willing to call myself an Effilist, but I'm definitely not in opposition to them. I kind of see them as like another like ally, like the other three movements or other three political alignments that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree with cosmic. I think the assessment is purely biological. But regardless of that, yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that. I appreciate it. Mark, is there anything else you wanted to touch on?
I was just curious if you believe that we touched on the majority of your worldview and philosophy, or if you felt like we needed to delve into any other areas or needed addressing, or if you had any other comments that you'd like to clarify.
Well, I don't think I really mentioned how a Foucauldian might come toward anti-natalism, because that's kind of who I borrowed from as well in one or two of my videos. A Foucauldian understanding of I think how politics gets created and how discontinuities might also develop in discourse that allow for anti-natal views to come out pretty much. I think that we also might have to address like mental health at some point. I think Foucault and Fisher offer really interesting discussion into mental health. And I think Cabrera could also enter into that sort of a discussion. So there could be three people having a discussion on that, on like anti-natalism and mental health, and Foucault's great confinement, and Mark Fisher's finding that like it's not sufficient enough to say that it's necessarily our mental states coming about from neurological processes that give about structures of depression that we find ourselves in, but rather that we keep making our social conditions that are depressing that we don't know how to get out of. And I think that one example of like how you could see this would be in the movie Children of Men, when he was walking through this gallery of like the rich dude, and I think he was in like London or somewhere in the UK, and he was like yelling at his son to take the pills. I don't know if you remember that part, but like that just speaks of what Mark Fisher spoke of. Like taking the pills isn't going to do anything because you're still living in the social conditions that make you depressed.
Right.
So what do you do? And there's many ways of dealing with that, from like existentialism to different types of cognitive therapy to whatever you want, really. I don't even think that therapy must be mandatory, or that therapy is even the best option for everybody. I think everybody should like define what their own therapy is and try to do the best they can, pretty much. I don't know if I answered that or if I kind of just segued off into like some non sequitur.
No, that's good. Thank you for bringing up Foucault, because we didn't chat about him, so it's really great. And I think one recommendation is like the Foucault Reader, I believe.
Yep.
To get a good rundown of his ideas.
So yeah, Seven, is there anything you'd like to plug before we end it today?
Yes, of course. You can always follow me on Twitter and follow me on Twitch. I usually play video games on Twitch. I don't really talk about anti-natalism that much, but if you are an anti-natalist and you want to watch an anti-natalist Twitch streamer play some pretty awesome games like Apex Legends or Cyberpunk or anything else, just check it out.
Yeah, I highly recommend the Twitch streams. Very, very, very enjoyable.
But,
there really is so much in your videos, Seven, that I would love to further discuss. I mean, just in the interest of time, I hope that we've covered a good amount of it today. And, I really do want to thank you so much for being on Exploring Antinatalism. You are an incredibly fascinating individual, very articulate, very brave. And I hope, whether people agree with you or not, that your channel is given the time it deserves by more people. It truly is one of the most unique, speculative visions of antinatalism in the antinatal world. So thank you for what you do.
Yeah, no problem. It's an honor to be on this podcast. I love the episodes that you guys produce. I think you guys arguably are making some of the most important antinatalist content. And also we need to, I think arguably the most important discussions that you guys have been with what I call the antinatalist triumvirate, which is Cabrera, Benatar, David Pierce, in my opinion. I think those are probably the three most central figures to everything we're doing. I think everyone's in discussion with those three at some point. So I think it's awesome that you guys are able to get all three of them on at some point. I think it was very important, especially Cabrera, because I don't know how precarious that situation was with getting him on or not, but it was impeccable. The interviews are fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Seven. Thank you so much for saying that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's only been year one, so.
Yeah, we're booked, I think, until June of next year. So there's a lot more coming. So yeah, thank you so much. Please subscribe to Seven of Swords on YouTube. Make sure to catch one of his streams on Twitch, follow him on Reddit, Twitter, and Spotify, and also check out his reading list. Links in our description. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. This has been Amanda Oldphan Sukenick and Mark J. Maharaj. You can find us on our YouTube channels, Foreverwolffilms and !, respectively. Links below. Keep up with my daily anti-natalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and email us at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. The podcast can be listened to on our YouTube channel, Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, as well as Buzzsprout, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. And proudly announcing the official website for the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, www.exploringantinatalism.com, has been completed, and it is gorgeous. Designed by the amazing Visions Noirs. Please visit Visions Noirs at www.bilenoir.com and check out more of his links below. Podcast artwork donated by the incredible Life Sucks. If you would perhaps like to purchase one of the new Exploring Antinatalism t-shirts by Life Sucks, please visit his Etsy page at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. All the best and bye for now.